The air at the county equipment auction hung thick and heavy, a humid mix of diesel fumes, dust, and the bittersweet smell of old iron giving up the ghost. It was the summer of '74, and everything felt supercharged. The price of corn was pushing $3 a bushel, something my father would have called a fever dream, and the banks were handing out money like it was gospel tracts at a revival meeting. I stood near the back, my arms crossed over my chest, my shadow long in the late afternoon sun. My name is Silas Blackwood. I farm the same quarter section my grandfather broke with a team of mules, and my father tamed with a Farmall H. I was there for a Massey Ferguson 35 utility tractor, a little gas-powered rig with a front-end loader. My old Ford 8N was getting tired, and the loader would save my back more than I cared to admit. I had a limit, a number written on a slip of paper in my pocket, a number I'd arrived at after weeks of figuring. It was a cash number. I didn't borrow, not for iron. That's when he pulled in. Dale Evans. He didn't just drive, he made an entrance. His truck was a brand new, two-tone Ford F-250 Ranger, the kind with chrome that could blind a man from 100 yards. It was still towing the planter he'd used that spring, a John Deere 7000 6-row, and it didn't even look like it was breathing hard. He'd bought the old Miller place, right next to my eastern fence line, the year before. He'd bulldozed the old farmhouse, put up a sprawling ranch-style house with a 2-car garage, and erected a Butler machine shed that looked bigger than the county courthouse. He swung out of the cab, all confidence and cologne, wearing a seed corn cap that was still stiff with newness. He saw me and sauntered over, his new boots crunching on the gravel. "Silas," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Didn't figure I'd see you here. Thought you were still trying to get that old Farmall of yours started for the season." A few of the other farmers nearby chuckled. I just nodded. "She started, Dale. Same as she has for the last 25 years. My tractor was a 1953 Farmall Super M. Its red paint was faded to a dull orange, and there were patches of honest rust on the fenders where my father's boots had worn through the metal. But I knew every bolt, every wire, every quirk of that machine. The engine didn't just run. It breathed with a rhythm I understood better than my own heartbeat. And the most important thing about it, the thing that let me sleep at night, was that it was mine. The title was in my filing cabinet, not at the Farmers and Merchants Bank. Dale clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look friendly, but felt like he was checking for structural integrity. "Well, good for you. Me, I can't be bothered with that old junk. Time is money, you know." He gestured with his chin over to the prize of the auction, a gleaming John Deere 4430, with a sound guard cab, barely 2 years old. It still had the new tire smell. Thinking of picking that up for my cultivating tractor. A man needs to stay modern to get ahead. I looked at the 4430. It was a beautiful machine, no doubt. Air conditioning, a radio, hydraulic, everything. It was a palace compared to the open-air seat of my Super M. But I also saw the ghost of a loan document hovering over it, a long string of payments stretching out for years. Dale wasn't just buying a tractor. He was buying a monthly bill, a weight that would sit on his chest every time the rain didn't fall or the market took a dip. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Bill Hemlock, started the bidding on the Massey Ferguson. I let the tire kickers and the dreamers have their fun at the start. My number was $1,200. Not a penny more. The bidding climbed. 800, 950, 1,000. I raised my hand at 1,100. A man in overalls I didn't recognize bid 1,150. I came back at 12. He hesitated, looked the tractor over one more time, and shook his head. "Sold! Bill yelled, pointing his gavel at me. "To Silas Blackwood for $1,200. I felt a quiet satisfaction. It was a fair price for a good machine. As I walked to the clerk's trailer to pay my bill, in cash, Dale stepped in front of me. $1,200 for that little thing," he scoffed. "You could have put that down on a real tractor, Silas. The bank would have given you the rest. You got to think bigger." "I think about sleeping at night, Dale," I said, stepping around him. He just laughed, a loud, booming sound that drew more attention than he probably intended. "You can't sleep your way to prosperity, old man." The bidding started on the 4430. Dale opened at 15,000, a power move to scare off the small-timers. It worked. The price climbed, but it was mostly between him and a big operator from the next county. The numbers got dizzying. 18,000, 20, 22. Dale stood there with a smug grin, raising his hand without a moment's hesitation each time. He won it for $24,500. A roar of applause went up from the crowd. He was putting on a show, and people loved it. He signed the bank paperwork right there at the clerk's table, the loan officer from town smiling and shaking his hand like he'd just won the lottery. In a way, the banker had. Dale had just shackled himself to the bank for the better part of a decade. He'd bought himself a shiny green tractor, but he'd also bought a new boss, one who wore a suit and tie and cared about interest rates more than rainfall. Now, before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you folks watching this, have you ever known a man like Dale? The kind who measures his worth not by the sweat on his brow or the grain in his bin, but by the shine on his chrome and the size of his bank loan? Let me know down in the comments, because I've known a few, and it seems like their stories always end up in the same place. I got the Massey home that evening and parked it in the barn next to the Super M. The old Farmall looked tired and plain next to the newer, though still used Massey. But there was a dignity to it. It was a survivor. Like my father. Like me. I laid a hand on its warm hood, the metal still holding the heat of a long life of work. Out on the main road, I could hear the deep-throated rumble of Dale's new 4430 as he drove it home, the radio probably blaring. To everyone else at that auction, he was the winner. He was the future. But as I stood there in the quiet of my barn, smelling the familiar scent of hay and old oil, I wasn't so sure. I was a man who owned his farm and his iron. Dale Evans was just a man who was allowed to use them as long as he made the payments, and I had a feeling the bill for his kind of thinking was going to come due eventually. The next spring put our two philosophies to the test. The ground thawed early, a gift from the heavens, and every farmer in the county was itching to get into the fields. Dale was first, of course. His new 4430 was hitched to an even newer piece of equipment, a 12-row planter he'd bought over the winter. He was a blur of green and yellow activity, his diesel engine a constant, powerful hum on the horizon. From my back porch, I could see him cruising across the old Miller place, sitting up high in that air-conditioned cab, probably listening to the farm report on WGN. He had his fields planted in 3 days. The talk at the co-op was all about his efficiency, his modern methods. I, on the other hand, was wrestling with the past. I'd pulled the Super M out of the shed, and she was being cantankerous. The old girl turned over, coughed, and sputtered, but wouldn't catch. The sound was weak, anemic. It wasn't getting a hot enough spark. I knew right away what it was. The magneto. An International Harvester H4 magneto. The same one that had been on it since it left the factory. It had been getting progressively weaker for years, but I'd always managed to coax it back to life. I pulled the plug wires and held one near the block while I cranked the engine. The spark that jumped the gap was a pathetic, sickly blue-orange. It should have been a thick, snapping, blue-white bolt of lightning. I sighed, pulled the tool chest over, and set to work. First, the 2 bolts holding the magneto to the governor housing. I had to be careful not to drop the gasket. Then, I carried the heavy cast-iron unit over to my workbench, the one my father had built from reclaimed barn wood. The smell of ionized air and old grease hit me as I popped the cap off, just as I suspected. The points were pitted and corroded, the little tungsten contacts burned into a miniature mountain range. I took out my feeler gauge and a point file. For the next hour, I sat on a stool, my world shrunk to that tiny gap, carefully filing the points, smooth, trying to get a perfectly flat surface. I'd clean them with a rag dipped in gasoline, then hold them up to the light, squinting to check my work. I set the gap to 15/1000ths of an inch, exactly as the manual specified. I checked the condenser with my old multimeter. It was weak, but probably had 1 more season in it. I put it all back together, the satisfying click of the cap locking into place, and bolted it back onto the tractor. I climbed into the iron seat, pulled the choke, and hit the starter. It coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with a clean, crisp bark that rattled the windows of the machine shed. I smiled. It was a sound of victory. But I'd lost half a day. By the time I had my 4-row planter hitched up and was dropping seed into the ground, Dale was already done and was cultivating his corn for the first time. He drove by my place on the road, slowing his big green machine just enough to lean out of the cab. "Having some trouble there, Silas," he yelled over the engine noise, a wide grin on his face. "Just giving her a little tune-up," I called back, not giving him the satisfaction. "Right," he laughed. "My dealer gives my tractor a tune-up every winter. You ought to try it sometime. Saves a man a lot of grease under his fingernails." He gunned the engine and sped off in a cloud of dust, leaving me in the quiet rhythm of my old Farmall. Pop, 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 pop. The whispers followed me into town. When I went to the diner for coffee, I'd hear them. "Silas is falling behind," one would say. "Can't keep up with that old equipment," another would add. They saw Dale's perfectly planted fields, the straight rows looking like they were drawn with a ruler. They saw my fields, where I'd had to fight a wet spot that cost me another day, making one section a little later than the rest. They saw Dale buying another 80 acres at the end of the summer, and they saw me putting a new roof on my barn. They saw progress and ambition in him, and stagnation in me. That harvest was a tough one. A wet spell in late September turned the fields into a muddy quagmire. Dale's new 4640 tractor, which he'd traded the 4430 in for, had 4-wheel drive and big flotation tires. He got his massive new International combine into the field and slogged through, leaving deep ruts but getting the crop out. My 2-wheel drive Super M couldn't even pull an empty gravity wagon through the soup. My combine, a used John Deere 7700 I'd bought with cash a few years back, was lighter, but it was still a struggle. I had to wait. I watched the sky for a week, my stomach in knots, as the corn stood in the field, drying down, losing test weight every day. Dale finished his harvest, his grain trucks rolling to the elevator day and night. He caught the peak of the market, selling his corn for close to $3.50 a bushel. By the time my fields were dry enough to carry the equipment, the price had dropped 20 cents. It was the difference between a good year and a great one. At the elevator, as I waited in line to unload, Dale pulled up beside me in his shiny Ford. "Tough break with that weather, Silas," he said, though he didn't sound sympathetic at all. "If you had the right equipment, you could have gotten it out. That 4-wheel drive makes all the difference. But hey," he added with a wink, "at least your tractors are paid for, right?" He laughed and drove off toward the scale. I just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my old Chevy C60 grain truck. He was right, of course. Better, newer equipment would have saved me that 20 cents a bushel. The math was simple. But the other side of the equation, the column with the interest payments and the sleepless nights, was the one he always refused to see. That year, I made enough to pay my taxes, buy my seed for next year, and put a little away. I heard Dale bought a boat. The middle of the 1970s was a gold rush for farmers in the heartland. The export markets were booming. Russia, China, they all wanted our grain. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butts was on the radio telling us to plant fence row to fence row, and by God we did. Land prices, which had been creeping up, suddenly exploded. A parcel that sold for $500 an acre in 1970 was going for $2,000 by 1976. It was a heady time. The banks were practically begging us to take their money. Your net worth is increasing every day, the loan officers would say. Leverage it, expand, get bigger or get out. Dale Evans took that advice as his personal gospel. He was the poster child for the new era of farming. Every time a neighboring farm came up for sale, Dale was there, outbidding everyone. He wasn't paying with cash. He was paying with his rapidly inflating land values. The bank would reappraise his existing property at the new, higher value and lend him the difference to buy more. He was building an empire on paper. His equipment lineup became a local legend. The 4640 was traded for a brand new John Deere 4840, a beast of a machine with duals all around. He bought a second combine, another massive axial flow, so he could run 2 machines during harvest. He hired a full-time man to help him. His operation was a constant hive of activity, a shining example of modern, aggressive agriculture. He built a new house for his hired man, put up another grain bin, and paved his driveway. I watched it all from my side of the fence. The boom years were good to me, too. I was getting the same high prices for my corn and soybeans. The money was flowing in, more than I'd ever seen before. But I remembered the stories my father told me about the 1920s, another boom time that had felt like it would last forever, right up until the moment it didn't. He'd seen his own father, my grandfather, lose a neighboring farm he'd bought on credit when the bottom fell out. "Never bet the farm you have for a farm you want," he used to say. "Debt is a wolf that's always at the door, son. It just sleeps sometimes." So while Dale was expanding, I was reinforcing. I used the profits from those good years to pay off the last of the mortgage on the original quarter section. The day I walked out of the bank with the deed in my hand, free and clear, was one of the proudest of my life. There was no ceremony, no applause, just a quiet handshake from the bank president and a piece of paper that said, "This land, this soil that held my family's sweat for 3 generations, was truly ours." I didn't buy new tractors. I overhauled the engine on the Super M, putting in new sleeves, pistons and bearings. I did the work myself in my own shop over the winter. It ran better than it had in 20 years. I replaced the worn-out corn head on my 7700 combine with a newer used one I found at a sale 2 counties over. I paid cash. I put in tile to drain a wet spot in my north field, improving my yield. And the rest of the money? I put it in the bank. I bought certificates of deposit. It felt safe, solid. My neighbors thought I was crazy. Dale was the most vocal. He'd see me at the co-op and shake his head in mock pity. "Heard you paid off the old home place, Silas," he said one afternoon, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Congratulations. Now you own 160 acres of yesterday. I'm farming over 1,000 acres of tomorrow." "You're renting 1,000 acres from the bank, Dale," I corrected him quietly. He flushed, his good mood souring. "It's called leverage. It's how the game is played now. You're sitting on a gold mine with your equity, and you're too scared to dig. You're a museum piece, Silas, a relic. While you're sitting there polishing your old tools, the rest of us are building the future." He was convincing. He looked the part. He had the new trucks, the big house, the sprawling acres. I had my old tractor, my paid-for land, and a passbook from the savings and loan. To the outside world, he was a captain of industry, and I was a timid old man, afraid of his own shadow. The tide of opinion was with him. The bankers, the equipment dealers, the other farmers, they all saw Dale as the model to follow. I was the cautionary tale, the man who lacked the vision to seize the moment. But as the 70s drew to a close, little things started to change. The news on the radio was filled with talk of inflation. The price of fuel nearly doubled. The cost of fertilizer, of seed, of parts, it all went up. I'd go into the dealership for a simple hydraulic hose for my old planter, and the price would make my jaw drop. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, paying bills, listening to the radio. A man with a deep, serious voice was talking. His name was Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. He spoke about the need to break the back of inflation and warned that it would require strong medicine. I didn't understand all the economic terms he used, but I understood the tone in his voice. It was the sound of a man about to turn off a spigot. A few days later, a letter came from the bank. It was a notice informing me that the interest rate on my certificates of deposit had been raised. It was good news for me, a little extra return on my savings. But as I folded the letter, a cold dread washed over me. I knew that the bank wasn't just giving away money. If they were paying more to savers like me, that meant they had to be charging a whole lot more to borrowers. Borrowers like Dale Evans. The wolf my father had warned me about was starting to stir from its sleep. Outside, a cold autumn wind rattled the window pane, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a storm was coming that had nothing to do with the weather. The winter of 1979 felt different. It was colder, the wind carrying a sharper bite than I could remember. It wasn't just the weather. A chill had settled over the farm economy. The news from Iran and the hostage crisis dominated the radio, and the price of diesel fuel seemed to jump every time a tanker got sideways in the Suez Canal. My operating costs were rising, but I had a cushion. I bought my fuel and fertilizer for the next season before Christmas, paying cash to lock in the price. It was an old habit my father had taught me, buying what you could when you had the money, not when you needed it. Dale, on the other hand, was still living in the boom. That winter, he tore down the old Miller barn, a beautiful hip-roofed structure that had stood for 80 years, and put up another massive steel machine shed. He needed the room, he told everyone at the diner, for the new planter he had on order. A John Deere Max Emerge, 24 rows of precision planting technology. It was a magnificent piece of engineering, capable of planting 100 acres before lunch. It also cost more than my father had paid for our entire farm. The first real crack appeared in the spring of 1980. The ground was perfect, just dry enough to work without compacting, and everyone was in a hurry. I had the Super M out, pulling my old 6-row International planter. The engine settled into its familiar, rhythmic pop, 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 a sound as comforting to me as my own breathing. Across the fence, Dale's operation was a symphony of modern power. His hired man was in the 4840, pulling a 30-foot field cultivator, and Dale himself was following right behind with the new 24-row planter hitched to an even newer tractor, a massive John Deere 8640, articulated four-wheel drive. It looked like a dinosaur crawling across the prairie, its 8 huge tires churning the black soil. I was nearing the end of my first 80 acres when I noticed the silence. The constant, deep-throated roar from Dale's fields had stopped. I looked over and saw the big 8640 sitting motionless in the middle of a pass. A few minutes later, Dale's pickup truck came speeding down the field road. I kept planting, but I kept an eye on the situation. An hour passed. Then 2. The dealership service truck, a big white Ford with the green John Deere logo on the side, finally arrived. I finished my field and was heading back to the barn when I saw Dale walking across the freshly worked dirt toward my fence line. His face, usually tanned and confident, was pale and tight. His new seed corn cap was pushed back on his head, and he was wiping grease from his hands with a rag, though I knew he hadn't laid a wrench on that machine himself. "Silas!" he called out, his voice strained. I throttled down the Super M, the engine quieting to a low rumble. "Dale, having some trouble?" He kicked at a clump of dirt. "Trouble? I'd say so. The damned transmission won't shift out of park. Some kind of electronic solenoid, the mechanic says. It's a sealed unit. They have to pull the whole cab off just to get to it." He shook his head in disbelief. "The cab? On a tractor? Can you believe that?" I could. I'd seen the inside of those new machines at the farm shows. They were a web of wires and computer modules. Powerful and comfortable, but a nightmare to fix if you didn't have the diagnostic computer to talk to them. "He says the part is on back order in Des Moines," Dale continued, his voice rising with frustration. "It could be 3 days. 3 days. In the best planting weather we've had in a decade. I've got 1,000 acres to get in the ground, and my brand new $100,000 tractor is a lawn ornament." I looked at my old Super M, its simple gear shift lever sticking up from the transmission housing, connected by nothing more than solid steel linkage. I could replace the whole transmission with a set of wrenches and a chain hoist if I had to. "That's a tough break," I said, and I meant it. No farmer wants to see another man down during planting season. He looked past me, at my simple, outdated rig. For the first time, I didn't see pity or condescension in his eyes. I saw a flicker of something else. Envy, maybe. "Yeah, well," he muttered, "I guess this is the price of progress." He turned and walked back toward his silent green giant, a captain stranded on a high-tech island in a sea of black dirt. He ended up renting a tractor from a neighbor to finish planting, at a cost of $50 an hour. The delay, the rental, the eventual repair bill, it was a cascade of expenses that cut deep into his cash flow. But the real trouble was just beginning. That summer, the sky turned to brass. From June until August, it didn't rain. The corn, which had come up so beautifully in that perfect spring soil, began to suffer. The leaves curled up during the day, a thirsty, desperate gesture, turning a sickly pale green. The tassels emerged weak and shed their pollen before the silks were ready. My corn suffered just like everyone else's, but my costs were fixed. My land was paid for. My machinery was mine. I didn't have a note at the bank that demanded payment whether it rained or not. Dale was in a different world. He had mortgage payments on 4 different farms. He had loan payments on 2 combines, 3 tractors, a dozen wagons, and a planter that cost more than my house. And now, the grain embargo President Carter had slapped on the Soviet Union had sent the corn market into a free fall. The price was collapsing at the very same time his crop was withering on the stalk. The wolf was not just awake now, it was howling at his door. The fall of 1980 was a grim harvest. The yields were half of what we'd hoped for. The price at the elevator was barely enough to cover the cost of production for a man with debt. I saw Dale at the co-op one afternoon. He looked like a different man. The easy smile was gone, replaced by a permanent frown etched into his face. He'd lost weight, and his eyes were hollow with worry. He was on the phone in the office, and I could hear his strained voice through the glass. "What do you mean the rate went up again?" he was saying. "It's an operating loan. It was 8% when I signed the papers in March." He came out of the office, saw me, and just shook his head. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The news was all over the county. The prime interest rate, the number the banks based all their loans on, was climbing like a rocket. 10%, 12, 15. Paul Volcker was keeping his promise. He was breaking the back of inflation, but it felt like he was breaking the back of every farmer in America to do it. For me, it was a strange paradox. The money I had in my savings account was suddenly earning 10, then 12% interest. It was a nice little bonus, but for Dale and thousands like him, those same numbers were a death sentence. His variable rate loans, the very financial tools that had allowed him to expand so aggressively, had become a tightening noose. Every month, the payment grew larger, even as the value of the crop he was selling to make that payment grew smaller. The great machine of leverage and credit that had built his empire was now running in reverse, and it was tearing him apart. The winter that followed was the quietest I can ever remember. The usual optimism that carried farmers through the cold months was gone, replaced by a thick, pervasive dread. The talk at the diner wasn't about new equipment or buying more land. It was about restructuring debt, about which banks were being patient and which ones were getting nervous. The word foreclosure and bankruptcy, once whispered in shame, were now spoken in the open, common as talk about the weather. The farm crisis of the 1980s didn't arrive like a sudden storm. It was more like a flood, the water rising slowly, inch by inch, until you were standing on the roof of your house with nowhere left to go. By the spring of '82, the prime rate had touched 21%. Land values, which had been the foundation of the boom, had utterly collapsed. Land that Dale had paid $3,000 an acre for was now worth maybe half that, if you could even find a buyer. He was upside down, as they called it. He owed the bank far more than his entire operation was worth. The bank, the same institution whose loan officers had once taken him out for steak dinners and encouraged him to think bigger, was now his enemy. They saw him as a liability, a bad number on a balance sheet. The friendly handshakes were replaced by certified letters. The calls were no longer about his plans for the future, but about liquidation schedules. I saw the signs of his struggle every day. He let his hired man go. The new 24-row planter sat in the shed, and he went back to using an older 12-row model to save on seed and fuel. He sold off one of the newer combines. He was trying to stop the bleeding, selling assets to make interest payments, but it was like trying to bail out the Titanic with a bucket. The hole was just too big. My life, by contrast, had changed very little. I still got up before dawn. I still climbed onto the faded red seat of my Super M. My income was down, just like everyone's, but so were my expenses. I didn't have a single interest payment to make to anyone. When a hydraulic cylinder on my loader started to leak, I didn't call a dealer. I drove into town, bought the seals for $10, and spent the afternoon in my shop rebuilding it myself. The money I had saved, earning that high interest, became my safety net. It paid my property taxes and bought my seed. I wasn't getting rich, but I was holding on. I was surviving. The end for Dale came on a cold, grey Saturday in November of 1983. The auction notice had been in the paper for weeks. It was a full liquidation. Everything was going. The land, the house, the machinery, the tools in the shop. The whole dream, dismantled and sold off to the highest bidder. I drove over there that morning, not to bid, but to bear witness. The farmyard was packed with pickup trucks from 3 states. Farmers, neighbors, and strangers walked through Dale's machine sheds, kicking the tires on his equipment, looking at his life's work with the cold, appraising eyes of buyers. The auctioneers, a team of 2 men in cowboy hats, stood on a flatbed trailer, their fast-paced chant echoing off the steel buildings. There was the John Deere 80RX40, the tractor that had broken down on him during planting. It sold for a fraction of what he'd paid for it. The big axial flow combines, his pride and joy, went for pennies on the dollar. I saw men I knew, men who were also struggling, buying pieces of Dale's operation for their own, hoping it would be enough to save them. It was like watching wolves tear at a carcass. Dale was standing off to the side, near the house his wife had so carefully decorated. She was beside him, her face a mask of quiet grief. He looked a decade older than he had that day at the auction in '74. His shoulders were slumped in defeat. He wasn't the confident, booming man who had called me a relic. He was just a man who had lost everything. He caught my eye from across the yard and gave a small, tired nod. There was no animosity left in him, only exhaustion. The auction moved from the big machinery to the smaller items, the contents of his workshop. They held up his rolling snap-on toolbox, the one I'd seen him polish with pride. The bidding was slow. It was a personal item, and maybe even the bargain hunters felt a pang of shame. They started holding up hand tools, power saws, his welding equipment. These weren't just assets. They were an extension of the man, the tools he used to build and repair, to create and to fix. I watched for a moment. Then I walked away from the crowd, got in my truck, and went home. There was no victory for me in his defeat. There was only a profound sadness, a sense of waste. He had played the game by the rules everyone had set, and the rules had changed in the middle of it. His ambition wasn't a sin. His only crime was believing the promises of a system that was designed to feed on that very ambition. That night, the wind howled around my old farmhouse, and it sounded like it was weeping for a lost generation of farmers. The auction was the talk of the county for months. A corporation from out of state bought most of the land. They hired a manager who lived in town and farmed the whole 1,000 acres with massive equipment and a couple of seasonal employees. The personal connection, the sense of a family tied to that specific piece of ground, was gone. It was just a business unit now, an entry in a ledger in an office in Chicago. Dale and his family moved into a small rental house in town. I heard he got a job driving a truck for the county highway department. I'd see him sometimes, plowing snow in the winter or patching roads in the summer. He always waved, but he never stopped to talk. One Saturday morning, about a year after the auction, I was in my shop, grinding the valves for the Super M's engine. I was covered in grease and lapping compound when I heard a truck pull into the yard. It was Dale's old Ford. He got out and walked slowly toward the open shop door, hesitating for a moment before stepping inside. "Silas," he said, his voice quiet. He looked around the shop, at the old drill press, the anvil my grandfather had used, the neat rows of wrenches on the wall. "Smells the same," he said, a faint smile on his lips. "Grease and iron. I miss that smell." "It gets in your blood," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. We stood in silence for a moment. I came to ask a favor," he said, looking at the floor. "The transmission in my wife's car is acting up. I think it's just a clogged filter. but I don't have a place to work on it. Or tools, really. I was wondering if— Of course, I said, before he could even finish. Pull it in. The floor is yours for as long as you need. All the tools, too. He looked up, and his eyes were glistening. Thanks, Silas. I appreciate that. He spent the rest of the day in my shop. I went about my own work, but I was aware of him there. The familiar sounds of a man working, the clank of a wrench, the hiss of compressed air, the occasional muttered curse, filled the space. It was good to hear. Around lunchtime, my wife, Martha, brought out 2 sandwiches and a pitcher of iced tea. The 3 of us sat on old tractor seats I used as stools, and for the first time in years, we talked. Not about farming or banks or the price of corn, but about our kids, about the high school basketball team, about the new pastor at the church. As Dale was finishing up, wiping the last of the transmission fluid from the concrete floor, he turned to me. "You know," he said, "I used to think you were crazy, scared even. All those years you could have been expanding, borrowing, getting bigger. I couldn't understand why you didn't." I leaned against the workbench. My father saw the 30s, Dale. He saw his own father lose everything he'd borrowed to buy. He told me that debt makes a man a servant to the lender and a gambler with the weather. I guess it just stuck. Dale nodded slowly, looking out the door at my old Farmall parked in the yard. He was right. I thought I was the master of it all. The big tractors, the new technology. I thought I was in control, but I wasn't. The bank was. I was just the guy they hired to do the work. When things got tough, they just fired me. He sighed, a deep, heavy sound. You, Silas, you were never anyone's hired man. You were your own boss all along. I just couldn't see it. That was my vindication. Not the whispers at the diner changing their tune, not the nods of respect from other farmers who had survived. It was that moment, in the quiet of my shop, with a man who had lost a kingdom, but found a piece of himself again. Years passed. The farm economy slowly healed, but it was different. The farms were bigger, the farmers fewer. The sense of a tight-knit community of families had been replaced by something more corporate, more distant. I kept on farming my quarter section. I never got any bigger. I never bought a new tractor with a cab or a radio. My son, John, came back to the farm after college. He had new ideas, but he also had a deep respect for the old ways. He was the one who insisted we give the Super M a full restoration one winter. We stripped it down to the bare castings, replaced every worn seal and bearing, and gave it a new coat of Harvester red paint with new decals, just like the day it rolled out of the factory in 1953. One crisp fall afternoon, when John's own son, my grandson, Michael, was about 10 years old, the 3 of us were out in the field. John was running the combine, and I was teaching Michael how to drive the Super M, pulling a gravity wagon. He sat on my lap, his small hands on the big steering wheel, a look of intense concentration on his face. "Grandpa," he asked, yelling over the engine's steady rhythm, "why do we still use this old tractor? Dad's friend has a new one with a TV inside." I smiled and throttled the engine down so we could hear each other. I pointed to the engine block, the simple carburetor, the magneto. "See all that, Michael?" I said. "I can take every single piece of this engine apart with the tools in our shop. We know how it works. We can fix it when it breaks. It asks for gas and a little bit of oil, and in return, it does an honest day's work. But the most important thing is this." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old, worn leather wallet. I took out a folded piece of paper. It was the original bill of sale for the tractor from 1943. "This tractor," I said, letting him feel the brittle paper, belongs to us. It doesn't belong to a bank. It doesn't send us a bill every month. It doesn't own us. We own it. There's a big difference. He didn't fully understand, not then, but I saw a flicker of it in his eyes. He looked from the piece of paper to the faded red hood, and he placed his hand on the warm metal. He was touching more than just a machine. He was touching a legacy, a story of survival, of patience, of knowing the difference between the price of something and its true value. I pushed the throttle forward again, and the old Farmall dug in, its engine singing its simple, honest song as we rolled across the black earth, a piece of our past pulling us steadily and freely into the future.